and welcome to Conversations on Sex, Addiction, and Relationships. I'm Wendy Conquest, and I'm here with my colleagues and friends Tim Stein, Jeannie Vitoni, and Dan Drake. And today we are going to be interviewing Heather Cronemiller. And Heather wrote a book entitled Going Deeper for Women. The subtitle is How the Inner Child Impacts Your Love and Sex Addiction. And she wrote this book with Lacey Bentley and Eddie Caprucci. And so I'm excited to have her on today because we talk a lot about sex addiction and betrayal trauma. And so a lot of times I think women who are sex and love addicts, women who are love addicts, we don't talk about a lot. I remember when we first started this podcast, we had someone on that specializes in that, but we don't get a lot of experts to be able to comment. So much less have a specific book dedicated to them. So I'm really happy to have Heather on today. How are you guys? What do you think?
Funny, Wendy, you were saying, I was just thinking of that. Our first podcast was, with Stacey Sprout and regarding love and sex addiction with women. And it's been a while since we've come back to that topic. Yeah. And that topic is very important, very pertinent for a lot of folks out there. And so I'm glad that we're back to this topic, but also that there's a new book, and there aren't that many books that cover this. So right. Super thrilled to have Heather here today.
Yeah.
Guys?
Tim was waiting. You were waiting for me. Wow. I just assumed you were going to talk. I'm sorry, Tim.
No, go, Dan.
It's a countdown. Who's going next?
Go for it, Tim.
I am looking forward to this conversation. I know in my own recovery that a significant part of my healing process was doing inner child work, and I trained in it with Pia Melody, and I do a lot of that work in our trauma workshops. And find it so powerful for most of the clients, not all, but most. And I am really looking forward to this conversation about sort of this inner child work and specifically applying it to women who are in their own recovery processes and some of the nuances to be aware of in that work with women and how it can be really helpful to them. So I feel like I'm in my wheelhouse and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Tim. I was actually the inner child part. I was really excited to go deeper with. I mean, honestly, just the idea of the depth work. I think there's so much underlying sex addiction, sex and love addiction, and so we've talked about different nuances, but I don't know that we've really gone into this specifically in terms of inner child work. So I'm really excited about that. I primarily work with male sex addicts or sex and love addicts, not female. So I'm actually really curious to have Heather's perspective, and I'm just really excited to have her here.
Okay, Heather, why don't you join us?
Hello.
Hey, Heather.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And so Heather, I guess I didn't mention also that Heather is a CSAT, so she's a certified sex addiction therapist, as are all of us. So I'm curious, Heather, how did this book start to come into existence?
Yeah, so Eddie had done a book for men, Going Deeper, How the Inner Child Impacts Your Sex Addiction for Men. And I was fortunate enough to be recommended that book by a client. So I was already familiar with his work. At that point, I was working with Lacey Bentley, one of the co-authors, creating content, creating e-courses, and we had an Instagram. And Eddie reached out and was like, "Hey, do you work with women?" And we're like, "Yeah." So we got on a phone call. We talked a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty starstruck because I really, really looked up to him and his work, and I had been using it with clients already. So we were just chit-chatting about things, and he's like, I keep getting these requests for the Going Deeper version for women because there's a need out there. And he asked if Lacey and I would be willing to help out, and we agreed. And yeah, I guess the rest is history.
That's great. Oh, what a wonderful story.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us what the book, tell us about the book. How is it? So, first of all, some women already identify as sex and love addicts, and so why would they want to pick this book up? And then for women that are wondering if they're sex and love addicts, I know that might be two separate questions. And Jeannie, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder there.
No, absolutely. But you're right, Wendy. I feel like, backing up of how does someone know if this book is right for them? Because some folks might have experiences, wonder if it's an addiction. I don't know if it's an addiction, love it. That sounds kind of maybe too big for what I'm going through, but maybe not. And so how would someone know this is the right book for them to check out?
Yeah, absolutely. So, love addiction in and of itself is kind of a misnomer, right? It's not true love that you are addicted to. It's the rush of infatuation that people are using to self-medicate, whether that's using it as a way to escape their lives, using it as a way to feel important or validated. When we're looking at, is this healthy behavior or addictive behavior, we look for things like, is it interfering with your life, right? A lot of the women that I work with are married, but they're looking for that validation elsewhere, right? So it's destroying their marriages. They oftentimes have kids and family that this acting out takes away from. So is it distressing you, right? Is this something that you are struggling with internally? A lot of times people don't make the choice necessarily to be like, I'm going to blow up my life right now, right? It's oftentimes a choice that is not within their value system, but because of oftentimes inner child pain, they make this choice. So it's oftentimes very, very distressing to them. So we see love addiction in multiple different forms. Like I referenced, it might be a married person having affairs, whether that's sexual affairs, emotional affairs, just flirting where it's not quite appropriate, but they're not quite crossing that line. It also might show up more in fantasy, right? It might be more thinking about, oh, if I had the perfect partner, it would look like XYZ. The fantasy of finding your soulmate, that can get really, really all encompassing and just kind of become everything the person thinks about. That would fall under love addiction. It might be staying in relationships with people that are no good for you, I should say, because you're scared to leave. So love addiction can look many different ways, oftentimes overlapping. So then we look at sex addiction, right? It's the same principles. You're using sex to self-soothe, to escape, to feel important. We'll see these themes over and over again. And yeah, it's interfering with their lives. They're having affairs. We see, and this is one of the differences between men and women, a lot of time women use love and romance and infatuation and porn, whereas I've worked with all different genders. Men I see using more sex, prostitutes, and porn. And it's not always the case. There's a big umbrella, there's a lot of overlap, but that is a difference that we see.
I think you did a beautiful job of describing love addiction there. Just I'm thinking of different clients and capturing all those nuances. So if there's a listener who's listening to that kind of description going, well, maybe I don't know if, okay, well, does one of that or part of something of that fit you? Does it match? Okay.
And I'd like to, we put out the word emotional affairs pretty easily, but what I find is that when clients come in and They're not sure if what they're doing is okay or not. I have to define what an emotional affair is. And so can we have a little bit of a discussion about that? Like how do each of us define an emotional affair? What is that?
You want us to answer or go?
Yeah.
Ooh, good one.
An
I would
emotional affair.
say,
Yeah.
I would say it's the getting the emotional needs met with someone who is not your primary partner.
What do you mean by emotional? What does it look like? What does it sound like? So I'm wondering, right, like somebody who's, let's say they're in a primary relationship or married, and there is a coworker that they like, that is attracted to them in some way, and it starts off by maybe having coffee, and then maybe it's drinks after work, and then maybe it's texting, and then maybe it's, and they can say, well, no, there's nothing there because we haven't touched each other, we haven't, but the relationship gets more and more frequent and intense. That person looks forward to seeing them, and then they maybe start sharing information about their partner or their spouse, and getting affirmation that it's a hard relationship, or maybe they shouldn't be in that relationship. And so they're getting a lot of connection from this person that they don't really have. It doesn't have a name to it. The relationship doesn't have a name to it. They're not really a friend. They're not, it can turn into a sexual relationship, but if we're talking about an emotional affair, then sex is not a part of that. How am I doing?
Yeah, I always wonder, if someone's doing something that, if there's a secrecy element to it, if I'm hiding something, if I am doing something different with my partner or spouse not there, that if I'm hiding something from them, to me, there's probably something going on to take a look at. If I'm doing something that, if I would function differently than when they were in the room, you know, and it's hard to quantify, I guess. But there's something that's really different about that. I think, like you said, I think there's something about, I get the support needs met from somebody else. I'm turning to this other person primarily to get affirmation instead of my significant other. Um, yeah, I think there might be an obsessive potential quality to it, a preoccupation with it. There's certainly I imagine a dopamine hit or an intensity that gets exciting and thrilling about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if the significant other discovers some of it, they're going to feel like, quote unquote inappropriate. It's going to be inappropriate. It's crossed a line somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's hard to quantify.
How'd we do, Heather?
I think that sounds great. I really appreciate the conversation because it is so hard to quantify, right? And it might even vary from couple to couple. So when I'm working with somebody, I encourage them to have this kind of conversation, right? Have it out in the open and just be honest. That's the biggest part, right? And understand where your boundaries are, where your partner's boundaries are, finding that I don't want to say compromise, finding that common ground and deciding what's right in our relationship.
Can I ask a question? This is going to steer us a little bit away. I'm aware of that, and we can come right back. But I've just had a hard time on when it's an emotional affair, the betrayed partner in this situation. If nothing quote unquote happened, there's no sexual contact. Yeah, I find that harder to sometimes for the person who's engaging in the emotional affair. They may feel justified in it, or they may feel, they may double down on it. Nothing happened, so they feel defensive about it, and there's nothing really to kind of say that this was a quote unquote betrayal. That's what been my experience on the betrayed partner side of this, and I don't know what your take would be in terms of, is this a betrayal? Is it like, how do you address this in a romantic relationship if this wasn't part of the agreement, and then there's a discovery of some kind of this kind of relationship? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I would say that it's a betrayal. At least in my relationship, that would be a betrayal, right? And I think that offering education to both the addict and the partner is important because, yes, it may not have been sexual, there might have not been genital intercourse, but there is an intimacy there, right? An intimacy shared with this other person that oftentimes does have that romantic, that flirtatious type of behavior that when you're in a monogamous relationship is supposed to be with your partner and only your partner. So I think looking at the intimacy piece and understanding the different types of intimacy might help addicts and partners kind of understand that there's still harm there.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of come back to something you said earlier, which was that might be very different for each couple.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's the transparency piece. Is this being shared, discussed in more of an open way? And what is comfortable and okay in one relationship may not be comfortable and okay in another relationship. And the hard thing is, I'm realizing is like so many couples don't have that conversation or stumble upon it and then feel a lot of pain and then have those conversations. But right, where is it inappropriate versus having friend? It's probably different for a lot of folks, and it depends on how they define their commitment to each other. So there's another piece that makes it more complex.
Let's talk about your book. So the title is Going Deeper for Women, how the inner child impacts your love and sex addiction. So, and I was reading through the book, and so can we talk about what it means? Because there's a lot of emphasis on the inner child. And so I don't know if a lot of people or our listeners understand what that is, what that means. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Let me start with the disclaimer that different people have different approaches to the inner child. So this may align with what listeners understand as the inner child. It might be slightly different, and that's okay, right? That's how we grow and learn. We bring different ideas to the table. So in this model, the inner child is that part of us that is stuck in the childhood pain. So it's often a part of us that is a younger age, often early childhood, when that trauma happened. For some of these inner children, it's a chronic trauma, one that has lasted for years and years and years. Other times it's one event. I've also found that, the age, it might vary, right? But it is it's that younger part of us that is still very stuck in the pain and hasn't been able to let go of it because the brain wants us to survive, right? So it remembers all the scary stuff. And yeah, this part grabbed onto that.
Tell me more about the model.
Yeah. So the model says that essentially this younger part of us, our inner child, remembers the pain of the past very intensely. And it's with us. It's always watching our lives. So when adult me, so I'll just use little Heather, right? Let's say little Heather was constantly rejected as a child. And that little Heather is always watching what I'm doing, what's going on in my environment, etc. When little Heather sees something that she perceives as me, adult Heather, being rejected, little Heather's like, nope, I know where this goes. I don't want to feel like I did back then. So then she essentially is like, move over, adult Heather. I'm taking the wheel and I know exactly what's going to help you feel better right here, right now, which is probably, flirting with some other guy so that I can feel validated again or accepted, right? So the inner child uses sex, porn, love as a way to meet their unmet need. But as we all know, that doesn't truly meet the need. So then we, as the adult, have to be able to understand what triggers our inner child and be able to walk with the inner child through the fear that comes up. So again, going back to my example with little Heather, the event that triggered little Heather would then lead to a situation where she might need to be comforted and reminded that she does belong. She is important. Um, Oftentimes that looks like visualizing or writing a letter. Sometimes it might be calling a friend, whatever works for that part to understand that she belongs. It's meeting that need in a healthy way and saying, it's okay, little Heather, like, I got this. I'm an adult. I can handle this. You don't need to try to save me, quote unquote.
I love it. Tim and I do a
Thanks.
lot of inner child work and definitely that training with Pia Melody. But
Tim was gonna say something there.
oh,
No.
really?
I was just going to say, I really love this inner child work. And one of the things that I often find really fascinating about it, and I assume that this fits into your model as well, is that most people are completely unaware that that dynamic is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially addicts, when those trauma wounds are triggered and that wounded little child steps forward and starts running the show, to them, that's just everyday life. To them, that's just the way that they've always managed things. And there's no awareness that there's this wounded part of them, this inner child that has sort of like stepped in and taken the wheel and is running the show. And I'm no longer amazed, but how sometimes all you have to do is look at somebody and say, when that happened, how old did you feel?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I felt super young, and that's just that opening. And as you do this inner child work and start to become aware of, oh, I'm feeling really young. Oh, there's this wounded part. It's like developing this relationship with that trauma wound, not because you want that trauma wound to thrive, but because you want to be aware of when it's activated so you can step in and nurture and heal it. Um, I worked, Jeannie and I both work from a Pia Melody's model with sort of like the inner child sort of being more based on sort of like what age things happened at. Your model
Mm-hmm.
seems to have like different characteristics or identify the inner child. What are some of the sort of characteristics that you identify as being really helpful for women to be aware of when their inner child is activated?
Mm-hmm. So are you saying like what's helpful? I don't really understand the characteristics part.
In your
Yes.
book, let me let me
Thanks.
let me pull this up. You
Do you
talk
want to like identifying the 10 different inner children? Is that what you're looking for, Tim?
well, you talk about the unnoticed child, the unaffirmed
Mm-hmm.
child, stressed child, the sexually abused child, and and so are those like different inner children? Oh, that's my stressed kid that's coming forward and moving forward, or is it just like, yeah, that's my teenager who's feeling stress?
Gotcha. Yeah. And that's one nice thing about this model is that we allow the client to kind of explore. So
Uh-huh.
for some people, they might have the one inner child. Like little Heather might have multiple different types of kids. It's very, very rare that we get somebody in therapy where they're like, I have one kid, an inner child kid, right? Oftentimes there's three, four, five, I've worked with a couple clients that is almost all of them, right? So some of them will just kind of put the pieces of the different types into one inner child. Some of them feel like having different inner child types and just saying, that's my stressed child, or my unaffirmed child is acting out again, you know? So that's totally up to the client and whatever way works best for them.
Sometimes, in these inner child models, we look at the inner child side, but we'll also spend a lot of time sort of building up what I tend to refer to as that functional adult. So it's like
Mhm.
you're training your functional adult how to parent these children and give them what they needed, which is that step beyond just identifying, oh, here's this part of me that keeps taking over. How
Mhm.
how what do you identify or what do you find helpful in sort of like building up the adult side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we do have a corresponding workbook that we dive into some of the more basics as far as like coping skills and things like that that you'd probably see in any therapy setting. And then the most important skill, I would say, in the inner child model that we use is that being able to identify the core emotional trigger is what we call it. So that unmet need that oftentimes looks like an I am statement. So it might be I am rejected, I am out of control, I don't belong, something like that. So being able to identify that, understanding the need that hasn't been met, and then what works best for you to meet that need. And that again might be talking to the inner child, it might be visualization, it might be letter writing, and gaining the trust of the inner child, right?
Mm.
It's one thing to be like, all right, I'm good, I got this. But if you're not living that day to day, the inner child's not going to trust you. They're going to be like, like you did on Tuesday, right? So being able to use skills like the coping skills, like being able to regulate yourself. We talk a lot about mindfulness. Using those skills every day is going to help that inner child part of you relax.
So I'm curious, Heather, what do you find most, I guess, on the flip side, most difficult for women kind of walking through this model, and then also the most, I don't know, the kind of most, the easiest part, or the kind of most rewarding part of it? I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. The shame aspect is by far the most difficult. It's very, very difficult for a woman to seek help, especially for sex addiction or porn addiction, right? With that kind of being labeled as a man's problem. And, things are changing. We're having these kind of conversations, but it is very difficult for a woman to come say, this is my issue. Not to mention that women tend to internalize their failures and their mistakes quite a bit. So breaking through that shame tends to be probably one of the most difficult, but also the most rewarding. That's one thing that I liked about Eddie's model to begin with, is that it is very focused on that self-compassion piece, right? It's not that you are broken or that you are crazy, quote unquote. It's that you've got this pain that you haven't addressed yet, that you haven't learned how to manage, and there's a way to do that, right? It's very hope-based in that as well. And then you asked, oh,
No, go ahead.
okay.
Which part I was just gonna say, how great that you have, they have the book where someone, if they already feel ashamed and they don't want to talk to someone about it, they can try it and check out the book, and then okay, now I feel actually some sense of unburdening from some of that shame, and then maybe I have more motivation to talk to another human being and not feel so much shame. That's great.
Yeah. My question was going to be, so if someone identifies, maybe this book is right for me, maybe this is what's happening for me, and the book sounds like it helps deconstruct what's going on, my thought would be, okay, so what's the end goal? Where would a person, what are they trying to get to? What does success, air quotes, success look like? Could you answer to that part or describe that a bit?
Yeah. So the end goal that we're working on is being able to, I don't want to say manage, but kind of manage the inner child, right? So that the inner child doesn't feel the need to take over. When they do feel the need, the adult version is able to help the child relax and for the adult to meet their need in a healthy way so that they can stop abusing sex and romance and fantasy and porn, and they can live a life that's really in alignment with their values and where they want to be, who they want to be.
So let me piggyback off that a little bit, just about what we're aiming for, because I know in my own work and with my inner children, it's often involved a lot of like developing my functional adult, but also a lot of visualization and just sort of sitting and meditating, being present with those inner children. And I like the way you described it, is that our adult is in charge, and that when those inner children come in, we're more aware of them and able to step into it. I know in my own recovery, the way that I've experienced that is that when I've gone inside and gone looking for my inner children, that oftentimes they were sort of disappeared, or they were off. At my visualization, they were off in a cave and all just covered with dirt. And I would bring them out to the courtyard and clean them up and play with them and take care of them. And as I continued to do that, literally over months and years, when I would go in to check in with them, they were hanging out there, and it was like I was already there. It was my functional adult hanging out with them. So we had developed a relationship so that they didn't have to go off the reservation, that when something came up, my functional adult was already there taking care of them and managing the show. And I know how powerful that was for me in my own healing journey. And as that evolution took place, how it showed up differently in my own behaviors, interactions, and ability to sort of be resilient. Um, I'm curious, in your own recovery, how has this shown up for you in your own personal work? And what are some of the nuances that might show up for you as a woman that would be different from what I, as a man who has gone through my own inner child work, how might those nuances show up differently for you?
Hmm. So I am in recovery from love addiction. And I also really enjoy the visualization and the meditation piece. So for me personally, my little Heather is a conglomerate of mostly the stressed child, the unnoticed child, and the need for control. So I would say the probably leading one is that unnoticed child.
Mhm.
So historically, I've used attention, flirtation, emotional affairs as a way to be noticed. Now, when I notice that I am starting to have those feelings that I don't belong, or, haven't been included in something like that, like my mind already knows that that is a trigger for me, right? Because I've done the work to be able to identify what those triggers are. So then I can go inside and talk with little Heather, make sure that she understands that she is loved, she's cared for, that I am there for her, right? Like, I think that relationship piece is the most important. And I know for some people that's really hard to be like, I belong with myself. But really, when you get in there and you start to create these relationships with these parts, it becomes apparent that it is a different part of you, and they can learn how to interact, right? It's really abstract. It's kind of like, at least for me, it was kind of uncomfortable at first, but that relationship piece is so beautiful. So for me now, it might look like a really quick check-in and like, I got you, right? Whereas before it was, I would get my meditation music on, I would walk myself through the visualization. So I feel like my experience really aligns with yours, Tim, that it becomes more natural and they're already together. Like, it's not this big process of like having to say all these words and do all these actions and lots of hugs. It's really pared down. So I think that there's a lot of overlap when it comes with to men and women, right? When they're using this model. Um, I will say that sometimes that relationship piece with those parts sometimes comes more easily with women just because we tend to be more relational. That's been my experience working with men and with women, but there's a lot of overlap too.
Well, Heather, thank you so much for being with us today and for walking us through this resource for women, sex and love addicts. And it was very educational and meaningful. So thank you so much.
Did we already ask if somebody thinks that this book would be helpful for them? The title again is Going Deeper.
For women. Mhm.
Yep,
Located
Going
where?
Deeper for Women, How the Inner Child Impacts Your Love and Sex Addiction. It's on
Am-
Amazon.
on Amazon.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you so much for doing this work and putting it together. I know it's such a powerful tool in therapy, and that you've made it, something that's accessible in a book that people can at least sort of step into and sort of find their way into it, if that'd be helpful. It's just so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
So for our viewers and listeners, if you like this episode, please give us a like. And certainly if you're not following us, please do that as well so you can learn about other episodes. And in the meantime, we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Heather.
Bye.